On 1+1, fact and fiction, can we ever know the truth about nuclear power? And two legends share their thoughts on life and success. Hello, I'm Jane Hutchin. Welcome to the program. Professor Barry Brook is the director at the Research Institute for Climate Change and Sustainability at the University of Adelaide. For the past 2.5 years, he's run a blog on climate change called Brave New Climate, his take on the latest thinking on climate science and policy. It's recently received its 1 millionth page hit. Professor Brook is one of Australia's most vocal advocates of nuclear power and has been following the unfolding situation in Japan since the earthquake and tsunami. Barry Brook is speaking with Mike Sexton.
Well, Barry Brook, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you.
Could we start talking about the events in Japan recently? Do they show the vulnerability of nuclear power or the way it's managed?
I think they show the vulnerability of any human infrastructure to the forces of nature, especially when they're unleashed with such fury as they were with that massive earthquake, the largest one to hit Japan in recorded times, and a 10-metre tsunami. I don't think it's reasonable to expect any infrastructure along a coastline like that to survive an event like that. But what it does highlight is that decisions were made back in the 60s when that power plant was planned and built that didn't anticipate the scale of the natural disaster that occurred here.
Well, is there a question of the design of these stations and future stations?
So these are amongst the oldest nuclear power plants in Japan, and they're put along the coastline for the sensible reason that they can use seawater to cool them. And as part of the design, they were protected not only against earthquakes by seismically isolating the plant itself, but by tsunamis. They predicted up to a 6.5 metre tsunami and had protected against that. But of course, as events turned out, the tsunami was even bigger than that, and it washed over the plant. Seems like it damaged the diesel generators that were supplying backup power. There was a chain of diesel generators, in fact, each one a redundant generator on the one before it. All of those were destroyed by the tsunami. The fuel tanks that would supply the diesel for many days for them seemed to have washed away, and the emergency cooling water as well was also damaged, such that they ended up having to use seawater to cool them. The design of those 40-year-old plants actually survived the earthquake. That they were designed for an earthquake 7 times less than what they got hit by, and yet they managed to survive that, but it was the tsunami that got them.
You suggested, though, in your blog site that it's not beyond the wit of engineering to have designed a backup plan that would have kept those plants functioning with power.
I think it's clear that the risk that a tsunami faced and the fact that all of those redundant generators were wiped out in one blow suggests that there wasn't enough prudent forethought for that risk. And in any sort of major accident that occurs in any industry, there's a period of introspection afterwards and looking at what went wrong, just like in anything in our lives, and trying to take the salient lessons learned and use that in the future. And so I see the announcements of governments around the world to relook at the safety of their current nuclear power plants. That's an eminently sensible thing to do, because you can look at all of the contingencies that they've allowed for and say, well, what if the situation in Japan happened to us? Are we then prepared? That's learning from the lessons of history.
Is it possible to ever design a safe nuclear power plant as such?
We already have safe nuclear power plants. Really safe nuclear power plants. I mean, we've had to have the highest order of natural disaster in order to endanger this plant, but it's not possible to design one that is risk-free. There will always be some element of risk, but that's true for any sort of energy generation source, or indeed just about any large infrastructure that we require. And to give you an example, we still depend heavily, obviously, on fossil fuels and on petroleum and natural gas. There was a refinery located outside of Tokyo that was damaged by the earthquake. A number of large containers containing petroleum products exploded in enormous explosions. Dozens of people around that area were killed. Vast amounts of chemical pollution was spewed into the atmosphere as a result of that and rained down on habitable areas. Could you avoid that with extra engineering? Probably not. If we're going to use liquid fuels, we're always going to have those sort of problems as well. But I find it sort of morbidly fascinating that people have ignored those sort of disasters and have focused so intently on the problems at Fukushima nuclear power station, which, although catastrophic in the sense of damage to that infrastructure, and the safety of the people trying to lock that plant down, is really serious. It hasn't endangered in any significant way any member of the public so far.
In other words, there's a perception of danger.
And I think it links back to this real concern people have for radiation and a misunderstanding of radiation. I mean, if you think about it logically, radiation's all around us. It's in the rocks, it's in the food we eat. When we decide to take an aeroplane flight, we're increasing our radiation dose significantly. If we decide to live in a mountainous area rather than down by the coastline, we're increasing our radiation dose. You can't escape that. That's a risk that everyone faces.
But it's not really comparable to the risks they're facing at the moment.